Hi everyone! Today I'd like to take you with me on my recent journey through revamping our OG Link from Ocarina of Time cosplay. Honestly, it was one of the first cosplays that we made here at NDLWRKshop. For those of you who didn't already know this, we have a few patterns inspired from the characters of Ocarina of Time, which are all up for sale now on our website. The pieces are all beautiful as is, but ever since I've started dabbling in leatherworking, I've been itching to rework our gloves and belts using real leather. There are also some issues with some of the original pieces that my perfectionist little heart just couldn't let go. And since I'll be reworking them anyways, I figured like making them out of real leather was just like the little extra pizzazz that could be interesting for the costume itself. I'll be using all our original patterns as a starting point, but I'll be modifying and adjusting them as needed to accommodate for the leather working process. Even though the hat isn't made from leather or anything like that, I've decided to also remake that piece since the original one I made was made before we revamped the final pattern for release. So it's actually not really accurate to what we're selling, and what we're selling looks really nice. So I'm gonna redo the hat, retake some photos just to re-showcase how nice it looks on our website. I think that kind of goes over everything. This one is a long one. There's a lot of hiccups along the way and a lot of things that I had to work on extra hard or rework many times. So yeah, strap in and let's get started. Sorry for the slightly bad lighting here. So the first thing we're gonna wanna do before moving on with anything else is print some stuff. I have all the patterns that I need. I just need to print the ones that are specific to what I need to do today. I actually have to go through our costume measurements because I haven't done this in a while. For the hat, you want the circumference of your head. You wanna start like at the lower part here and really go like around. And if you're wearing a wig, take that into account because the wig adds volume. So I know I have like big bangs at the front and my hat goes up to about here, but when you're measuring the circumference of your head, you kind of want to here. So let's see here. I have 55 centimeters. I think I'm gonna go with a small or a medium. I'm gonna go with medium. So this way I'm sure it's gonna accommodate my wig, and I'm gonna put a little snap in it. So if anything, if it's a bit too big, it wouldn't be a problem. Now let's take a look at the gloves because I haven't taken a look at those in so long. Forearm circumference and wrist circumference. So my wrist circumference is the thing is it doesn't match my glove. I know for a fact that it won't match my glove. My wrist is 16.5. That's a small, but my hand is not a small. I know for a fact my hand is not a small. So I think I'm gonna go with medium and maybe size it down instead of sizing it up. And then for my forearm, so forearm is this part right here. Let's take a look. So 22, again, that would be a small, but I know that the last one we made was too small, so I'm gonna go with a medium again. So I'm gonna go a solid medium all around. So medium hat, medium gloves, medium everything, and we will make little tests and fittings to make sure that everything is good. And that's kind of the problem. The first time I was not the one who took care of doing all this. So now that I am, I'm going to make sure that everything is good. So I guess before we get started on reworking the piece, we should take a look at the OG pieces and see like exactly what's not working or what I didn't like about them, so we can understand the modifications that I'm going to be doing. So I should also put a quick disclaimer that I'm not a leather worker or professional in any way, shape, or form when it comes to leather working. My specialty is in sewing. This is just my vibes, just me learning, dabbling, and vibing. So yeah. So the first piece that I really want to remake is the glove pieces. So what was wrong with the original gloves? Well, the big one for me naturally is that it was actually too tight. As you can see here, there's a gap Here's a smaller gap. This is the closest one fitting properly, and then there's another gap here. I think the girls had made it, so it wasn't really fit tested on me, and in my opinion, it ended up being a little too tight. So I decided to remake them, but I've personally decided to remake them using leather. So this is just me. I love using leather to make cosplay accessories. As mentioned, the cuffs were a little too small, but that's not the only thing I wanted to change about them. The way we made ours is they are very snug around the arm, which means that you wouldn't be able to fit your hand through and out, so you needed some kind of attachment. So ours have like these little Velcro tabs underneath to open and close the cuffs. Now, personally, I would rather not have the tabs. And if you don't want to have the tabs, the way to accommodate for that is to make sure that each cuff piece, the top one shouldn't be a problem, but including the one that is at the wrist and at the mid arm, need to be wide enough for you to squeeze your hand out of it. That's what I'm gonna attempt to do for my new leather gloves. So all you'll have is a seam, but you won't have the big tabs. Now for the gloves themselves, I'm gonna be remaking them again entirely from scratch. Straight up, making gloves sucks. Like, I think it's one of the most annoying things to make, even if our pattern I think is pretty as beginner friendly as possible. I mean, it's still making gloves, so it's not easy in any way, shape, or form. But if you don't want to make gloves, like if you're making this costume and you're not making it for like a competition piece or something, you don't have to. You can in fact just buy a pair of gloves that's close enough in color and modify them by just adding the pieces that are here and adding the piece that goes down there and then the cuffs on top. Bada bing, bada boom, you don't have to do the complicated part of the finger sewing, which is the worst part. But I will be making mine, and I'll go over some pointers to help kind of sew them and put them together when we get to that part of the vlog. So since I'm remaking the gloves, I want to remake the belt so that the boxy pieces that are on it match the stitching and the leather that is used for the gloves. I want everything to match. Originally, that's what happened. All the pieces match in terms of the materials used, and I think that would look good. Otherwise it's gonna be too different and it's gonna look kind of weird. So yeah, I want to remake that, but I also wanted to rework the belts themselves. Like, they weren't bad or anything, but I prefer when my sides are beveled. So I wanted to bevel the sides, and the ends of the belt were square, so I wanted to reshape them. And I think I just wanted to clean up some areas and actually finish the attachment around the buckle itself with rivets. So small things, but it's just gonna make the whole thing a little bit more sturdy. Okay, so I've already mentioned the hat briefly, but essentially when we made the pattern originally, we had patterned it a certain way, and then I had made and finalized the hat, including the video tutorial, which is still good. You can still reference it, it's not a problem. But we did end up reworking the pattern ever so slightly before releasing it, because we wanted to add a bit more thickness at the bottom parts of the hat. We've done mock-ups of it and whatnot, and I know that it looks really good, much better than the original one. So I absolutely want to remake the hat for that reason. So what materials did we use? Well, for the hat, I just got the same material we used last time, which was 100% wool, perfect kind of foresty green. For our locals around the Montreal area, I got them downtown in a store on Saint-Hubert. I'm forgetting the name of the store, but I'll write it on the screen. They have a lot of different wools of different colors, and it's really good quality. It's not cheap per se, but it's not particularly expensive in my opinion. I actually really love going to that store and just talking with the two owners because they're always very friendly and helpful. Okay, so I have two different types of leathers. I actually have three. I have two leather scraps that I got from C&M, also on Saint-Hubert Street. They had like a pile of leather scraps, so I just got some there because they had some very, very thin and supple leather, which is perfect for the part with the gloves. You do want some suppleness so you can move your hands and fingers around, but also if you have a heavy duty sewing machine, you can use your sewing machine to sew it. So our main leather piece is actually from OA Leather, which is an online store. Specifically, it is the English Stampede. I ordered exactly a quarter side, which is not a lot, so you don't have a lot of space for error, and it's 5 to around 5.5 ounce. It's slightly distressed, which looks nice in my opinion. And it's a soft to regular temper. So it's not like super stiff. A very stiff leather could have looked nice. I think the whole thing could have held its shape a bit better. But this one was already expensive as is, and I think something even stiffer would have been even more expensive. So we kind of found something that was more within the budget of the company. When doing leatherworking, you need a lot of other side materials. So I'll go over them as we go through the process, but just remember that you're also gonna need a wax thread in a matching color. So yeah, I think that kind of like ends like the little prelude section. So yeah, let's take a look at how everything went. Good morning, everyone. So day 2 of me working on the chaos that is the leather working for my link remake. Yeah. So the first thing is I've made myself a sample glove using the pattern in medium. I did adjust this part because ours, well, everything needs to be adjusted because our pattern is meant to be used with stretch. But leather, though it is malleable to an extent, it's not stretch. So we need to take that into account. The first thing I've done is make this here larger because you want to make sure that you can slide the widest part of your hand through it. So that's really important. Outside of that, I didn't make any adjustments to the gloves and I think it looks pretty good. It's actually like looking really, really solid. It feels a little too snug around the fingers. So what I'm going to do is the gussets that are in the middle, I think I'm going to make them a little bit wider, maybe like 3 millimeters each. If I add too much, it's going to become too loose and that won't look very good. And the reason I'm adding it in the gussets and not in the glove itself is because I don't want to add more volume here. I only want volume in the fingers and not the hand itself. Yeah, 3 millimeters for a total of 6 millimeters because if you add 3 millimeters here, 3 millimeters there, it's 6 millimeters all around. And that is more than enough. I don't want more than 6 millimeters. 6 millimeters might even be a bit too big. I might go for 2 for a total of 4. So the downside here of using this instead of our original technique of using a stretch full leather is you do end up with like looseness here and there's nothing I can do about that. This is here to stay. I need that extra width to put my glove on and off. The only thing is I think this is a bit too tight, so it has a tendency to do that. So I might add, let's take a look, like 1 cm. Yeah, I'll add 1 to 1.5 cm at the end. So like if I take my pattern, I would be adding it here. So that would be 0.5 on this side and 0.5 on this side, for a total of 1 cm in the whole circumference. So like you can see, this pattern needed quite a bit of adjustment. I decided to make it on fold as well, which is not what we had in the original one. So now I only have 1 seam and no seam on the other side. So the cuffs are gonna be fully finished like this. They're gonna be fully like cuffed in like that. Now these pieces I can all slide myself into. This one goes like this. This one is like the center one and this one is the bottom one. So as you can see, the idea is I can put on and off my gloves even with the little cuff pieces. So I really like the width of this one. This one goes right here in the middle. That's a good width as well. And this one goes right up against my wrist. And it hides my line here, which is very nice. So yeah, that would be my glove. I'm gonna have a seam because to an extent you need to have a seam, but it's gonna be much more discreet than the big tabs that we have on the original one. What you're doing in exchange to not having those tabs, essentially adjusting the glove so it's big enough for you to put your hand in and out of it without having to open those up. And for me, that is something worth doing. Once the mock-up was done, it was kind of time to do the real thing. I think I did mention in the previous clip that I had one of my 2 scraps that was slightly more supple than the other. My mock-up was done backwards of how I ended up doing. So the most supple of the leathers was used for the hand section, and the slightly more stiff one was used for the lower section, which is around my arm. Now, before I can start sewing any of the glove pieces together, I have to kind of create the little blocks that are on the back of the hands because I'm gonna need to kind of draw out the location of these and punch out my holes, sew them on before I can sew the glove and like finish it up. When it comes to little blocks on the back of the hands, I debated for a while like how I wanted to make them, because originally the character design doesn't have any apparent stitching. If anything, the original tutorial that we have for these pieces are the most accurate if you want it to be like game accurate. But for me, if you're using leather, kind of one of the beauties of it is to make it apparent that it's leather. So I like seeing the stitches on the leather. Having no stitches, I think kind of took away from the point of using leather. So I ended up settling on a design that had very visible stitching on it. So I did my first piece for my hand, and I think it looks cool, but I didn't use the dye because I thought the dye would be too dark. Like it came out too dark on this side, and I was like, oh, okay, well then I just won't use the dye. But now I'm looking at it and I actually like the edging like that the dye gives. I also went ahead and made that little piece that goes on the side, and I don't really like it. I don't know. There's something about it that doesn't quite work for me. Now for the small piece on the side, I debated whether or not I wanted it to be like in the same style as the big block, or if I wanted something like more flat. The flat one ended up looking kind of weird, so I undid that later and then just made the same style of pieces for both. I don't know why I thought it would be a better idea not to. No, I looked kind of weird. I was wrong. So before we even start stitching any pieces together, I'm gonna just go over a few things real quick. Number one, you're gonna want to dye the sides of your leathers. Obviously my leather that I bought had a finishing on it. So when I cut it, the sides is essentially raw leather, like untanned leather, I guess. I want to dye that section, and then I want to finish that section before sewing it in place anywhere. And it's gonna be true for all the pieces moving forward. What I was using is a Angelus leather dye. This one specifically was medium brown. If I had to re-choose, I think I would go for light brown in this case, but I just worked with what I had because this shit is expensive. So I'm just gonna make do with what I bought. I use a little paintbrush to be as accurate as possible because I don't want the leather dye to go on top of the area that is already colored, because it'll just kind of stain it darker, and that's not what we want. I'm going only on the sides here, and once my dye is fully dried, I'm gonna seal the sides. Now what I like to use is called tokono. So I just, again, I apply it with a brush on the sides, and then I use my burnisher to kind of seal it in place. You know, I don't think I did it for the small pieces. I think I only used my burnisher on the belts, which we'll see later. I think for the sides, all I did was use a rag and kind of rub it in to make sure everything was nice and sealed properly. Then once it's sealed properly, you can go ahead and kind of attach the sides to the top pieces using your leather thread. It's actually quite easy to make. The way you'd want to make it is whatever your piece is, you would want to make your rectangle of the size that you want on the back of the hand. In my case, I have two. I have one large one and I have a smaller one on the side. And then you want to create a long strip that you're gonna come and sew along the sides. So it's gonna go all the way around. I'm keeping my stitching here very simple, just doing some whip stitch to set it into place. I also made sure to put a little foam piece inside just so that it would keep its shape once it was attached to the glove. So now that we have our little pieces done, we can attach them to our glove. I am just tracing out where those pieces go onto the glove while it's flat, because it's easiest to do while it's flat. And then I'm going to kind of use my little leather, what are they called? Leather hole punchers? Not hole punchers. I'm gonna call it leather hole puncher, but yeah, they're like little tongs that you use, and then you hammer in holes, and it's to make small slits essentially for your thread. So I'm going to use my block as a point of reference to kind of position the holes that are going to go on the glove so that they match the ones that are on the little block piece. And then after, I'm going to go and pierce my holes. So there's many different ways to do this. I think using an anvil is the best when punching holes, but I don't have an anvil. So what I do is I have this scrap of really, really thick and dense leather that I put underneath, and I also have my cutting board underneath, and then I just use my little piercing tongues and a mallet and kind of go ahead and tonk my way around my leather pieces. It's a lot of work, but we haven't even come close to starting on the heavy duty stuff yet. So now that my gloves have all my holes for the little blocks to attach, I'm essentially gonna sew most of the glove, stop when it's only the side seam left to sew. I'm not gonna go into like a whole ton of details, like step by step on how to sew the gloves. There are super detailed instructions that come with the pattern. I invite you to buy the pattern and check the instructions that come with them for that part. But I will give a few little tips and tricks here to kind of help you work your way through attaching like the whole glove, because it's hard. It's annoying and it's hard. So there are some things you could do to kind of make it a little bit easier, in my opinion. First thing you're gonna wanna do, in my opinion, that really helps is drawing out your seam allowance. It's just really, really helpful because the seam allowance, at least for our pattern, is only 2 millimeters wide. So it's easy to misalign and just sew into nothing or have it not hold properly while you're sewing, because there's just not a lot of room to work with here. So when attaching the thumb, what I recommend is by hand with a needle and some thread, just whip stitch the thumb into place. And then take that little piece to the sewing machine and stitch in place following your marked seam allowance. It's gonna make such a huge difference because once you're sewing the two pieces together, you can see where you're sewing and it won't shift around because it's whip stitched together in place. It just makes the whole process a little bit easier. Similar logic here applies when putting in the gussets. So what happens is the gussets that go in between each one of your fingers, when you come to sew, they can shift around, which could be very annoying. You don't need to sew the whole thing. I don't recommend that. I just recommend whip stitching just a few millimeters at the top so it secures these two pieces together. And then you can start sewing all the way down to the inner part of the finger. And then when you get to that part, you're supposed to sew 2 millimeters past your cut line. And then from there, you can cut about 1 millimeter more and then kind of shift the whole piece around and keep sewing. I find that trick to be particularly helpful when you've sewn the gussets on one side, like the front side or the back side, and now you need to sew the other side. So if your gusset is shifting, it might misalign your front and your back. So by doing a little stitch by hand there to like keep it in place, it's gonna keep everything aligned properly. Like again, you don't have to sew the whole thing by hand, though you can if you find that that is helpful, but at least the beginning, just to give you a little legs up before you start sewing. For those who don't know, the gusset pieces are longer than what you need. The idea is to cut them to length after you're done sewing. It gives you a little bit more wiggle room for error, if you will. So again, it's as beginner friendly as it can get. If you don't want to do the gloves by hand, like it's not for a competition, just buy a pair of gloves. It's fine. Nobody will judge, and if they do, they're being poo-poo, so just ignore them. Now that we have most of our leather gloves sewn, before we close it at the sides, now's the time we want to sew the block into place. So the type of stitching that I'm using here, I don't know if it has a name, it probably does, but it's kind of, we're kind of looping in and out from underneath the glove. So always start threading with a knot at the end when it comes to leather thread. It's gonna go much better. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start from underneath the glove, come out, and then kind of like loop around my hole on the sides of my block. And then go back into the glove in the exact same hole I came out of, and then move on to the next hole. And then at the very end, once I'm done, I'm just kind of gonna go back into one of my stitches and knot a few times the same way I would knot off a button or something. And yeah, that's actually the stitch I'm gonna be using for a lot of different aspects of the glove. You'll see it again not so long from now. I don't know. I've never seen it before. I'm sure it's used in a lot of different projects when it comes to sewing leather. It's just the first time that I've thought of using it that way. And I'm kind of happy because it looks really nice and it looks really clean. If you're a kid, don't really attempt to work leather alone. I would get parental supervision for the whole thing. So to finish off the knots, I like to use a lighter and just kind of go over them because it kind of melts them and makes them more like tight and less likely to come undone. But also because my thread was particularly waxy, I like to go over my stitches real fast to kind of melt off some of that wax because it gives the thread a bit more of a lighter color, like shade of color, than it would if it wasn't so waxy. So that's something I will be doing throughout the whole project as well. So for the section on my arm of the gloves, my original idea was to do what we did in our original design, which is to have kind of the glove and then the cuffs lay on top of it. I didn't end up doing it that way. I actually ended up cutting a lot of these red sections into smaller sections that are then sewn straight to each cuffs individually. You'll see a bit later because I'm not quite there in the process yet. For now though, what I did want to do was my leather was very brown, but in the references I could see of Link, that section is actually a lot more red. I remembered that I had some red dye. Again, it was Angelis's brick leather dye. Always do a test first, so take a little scrap and do a little test to make sure that it's giving you the results you want, and also to kind of learn to use the materials properly. So the way I dye larger pieces of leather, I don't use a paintbrush. Paintbrush is just for the sides, for delicate work. When it comes to large pieces, you just take that little brush that comes with the dye, dip it, and kind of put it all over your dye as evenly as possible and kind of wipe off as much as possible after. You can add more than one coat if you want it really dark, but I was trying to not go too dark. So I only did one coat, then kind of evened it out as much as possible afterwards. And then I just let it dry. And honestly, I'm really happy with how that came out. And again, I didn't have to spend more money, so yay! Lots of notes. Okay, we're getting there. Honestly, most of this is gonna be just talking about the gloves. The gloves took forever. All right, so now that we kind of have our gloves, or at least a section around our hands, ready, we're gonna look over how I did the cuffs. My original idea for the cuffs was bad, but I'm still gonna go over it so you don't make the same mistake I did. So my thought process was I'm gonna do it the same way I did the little blocks on the hands. So I made long rectangular pieces based on the foam mock-up that I had made. And then I made long straps of leather to kind of go around it. That would be like the inside of the cuffs. And I was like, this is gonna work, but it didn't. It didn't, and I'll explain why in a few seconds. If you are making long rectangular pieces out of leather, what I recommend is using a box cutter and a ruler to make as straight lines as possible, and try to have them like stacked one beside the other so you can do like nice long cuts, so you're not doing like like that several times over. You know, you go flunk, 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 and it saves a bunch of leather. So yeah, it's a little self-explanatory, but just in case, you know, I'm sharing the information just in case. And then I like to use an owl, like a sewing owl, and my ruler to kind of trace out where I'm gonna be doing all my holes for sewing purposes. Once again, I'll use my little hammering station to hammer in all my holes. And in this case, it took forever. I had so many large rectangular strips of leather. And like it kind of implied, it didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. And the reason for that is because this section, like let's say you have your cuff here, this section is going to be here, isn't straight. And you can't really get the strips to turn into a circle. So those pieces need to be cut circularly. So another thing that came to my attention is that when I did this, originally I was going to use one of these. This took so long to do. I'm so upset it's not going to work. And then kind of sew in a circle. But as you can see, it doesn't work. Like you would have to somewhat stretch or work the leather to do that. And I find that hard and inconvenient. What I want essentially instead is to cut round pieces of leather with a hole in the center and then use that and then kind of sew that in place. I mean, it makes so much sense. Like it should be a no-brainer, but I don't know why. At no point did I even think of doing that, and I feel so silly for it. So yeah, after all this work, I kind of had to redo that whole section. And there's actually more than one reason why it didn't work out. This is only one reason, like design-wise, it just makes no sense. But for some reason, a lot more didn't quite work. So let's take a look at that. So I did start doing this, and I don't know why the sizing is really, it's off. Like this needs to be much longer for it to actually accommodate like me being able to put my hand in the smallest one. So those all need to be readjusted. Well, I really just need to redo the smaller ones and adjust the bigger ones, because I can use the really big one and then just make it adjusted so that it works for the mid-tier. And then I can take the mid-tier one and adjust it for the small tier. And then I have to remake the big tier one and make sure this time that I have the right lengths for everything. So yeah, D3. And I finally kind of organized my thoughts. I'm gonna start by finishing my gloves. And then once I'm done my gloves, we'll move on to the belts and we'll keep the hat for last. I recutted all my foam pieces to make sure once again that they were big enough for me to slide my hand through. And then once they were curled up and kind of would be ready to be used as cuffs, I measured the outer edge using my measuring tape. So this way I could make sure that I had the proper length. To try to save as much of my leather as possible, I wanted to minimize recutting as many pieces as possible. So I reused a lot of the leather, like let's say I would use the big leather strip that was for the outer cuff and make the smaller cuff out of it and just adjust it from there. Again, just trying to save some time, energy, and money as much as possible, because I didn't want to reorder leather, because you can't order less than like a quarter side, and it's really expensive to order a quarter side. So I was like, no, let's not do that. Okay, so I need to recut these pieces. So from what I'm seeing with the smaller pieces that I tested, I actually want to add about 0.5 to my measurement of each piece. So for the bigger piece, I had 30 and 30.5, so I want 30.5 and 31 in theory. So let's just go ahead and trace out everything we want. So 30.5, okay, no, that's pretty good actually. All right, so these would be my two longer pieces, which have been adjusted. I just want to make sure that they're wide enough. Make it just a hair wider. This one seems to be even wider. Oh, this one's way too wide. I'll adjust the foams instead. The foams are too wide, but I will accommodate just a little bit. So from there, to get like my inner piece correctly this time, I would sew the cuffs, the leather cuffs shut at the back with a simple whip stitch, very similar to what we did earlier. Again, I won't be mentioning every time, for instance, that I put the lighter on my knots and stuff, but just assume that all of this is being done, because it does secure your stitch in place better that way. And then once I had those pieces done, then I would re-measure the circumference of my piece just to be sure. And like using an app, like a radius to circumference app calculator, I made perfect circles that would in theory match the circumference of each of my pieces, and then cut new circular pieces out of my leather. And then I measured out like how thick I wanted my cuffs to be. Like it's about, I would go about the same thickness as the foam essentially, which in my case was about 5 millimeters. And then kind of traced out that from each one of the circles. So it's a circle that you cut, and then a smaller circle that you cut inside, and you have to make sure that everything is nicely positioned so it's nicely even all around. So once again, before moving forward, I made sure to finish all of my leather edges using my dye, followed by my tokonol, and like, yeah, everything needed to be nicely dyed and sealed to make sure it looked as pretty as possible. So then I had to add all my holes to my new pieces. I'm going like in a weird circular motion there, but it still worked pretty well. Just use like a tongue that has less ends so that it can work its way around a circle more easily. And then the way I sewed it originally essentially is, instead of them being kind of like this, which was what I had on here, I actually went more like this. They were kind of like side by side, and they would kind of curl out. And the way they were sewn together was just a whip stitch going all around. I also decided that for some of my cuff pieces, the foam was a little too thick. So to be a bit more comfortable when wearing them, I recut some foam pieces in a thinner foam, just so that it could be a bit more comfortable around my arms, especially since I didn't really account for the thickness of the shirt that Link wears. So I was like, oops. So yeah, making the foam a little bit thinner just gave me a little bit more ease, which worked out better that way. Now, at that point, I kind of had a lot of my cuffs sewn. I think I had like 4 of them fully sewn, but I decided to completely nuke my stitch. I didn't like this little curve stitch, and I was like, no, I don't want to do it that way, so we're gonna find another way to stitch it. All right, so where are we at? So I've kind of done a little 360 and redid all of these pieces. I'm gonna try to explain how I did the sewing for these pieces, like kind of using my hand as gestures, but essentially, let's say I have one piece here and one piece there. You can either position them like this, you can position them kind of like this, tip to tip, and I had them kind of smooshed like this. I didn't like that. I thought it looked kind of messy, so I undid all of my sewing, and the way I did it now is instead I have it positioned like this. So they're kind of overlapping, and it gives a much smoother and clean finish. You can still see all the stitching, which I like. I think that makes it look like, you know, like something that is made out of leather. I didn't want it perfectly smooth, but it's slightly cleaner. So what's the new sewing style, you say? Well, it's actually really similar to how we did the stitching of the little blocks to the glove piece. So essentially what I'm gonna be doing is, from the side piece, I'm gonna be coming in from under, then going into the outer layer, like kind of looping around it, and then going back into the side layer from the same hole that you came out of before moving to the next one. So it's that like little looping stitch thing, and because it's coming around the sides, instead of doing this, it kind of ends up like curving like this, which looks so much nicer in my humble opinion. Maybe you think all of this looks bad, like maybe you think that the apparent stitching isn't true to the character and it's not something that you would personally do, but keep in mind that it's something that I wanted. Like I wanted it to look like the leather was worked and that it looked like leather and that it looked hand stitched. Like, to me, that was part of the charm. And if any leather workers are watching this, like, you feel free to comment as we go. Give me your feedback. I welcome constructive criticism. Just be kind. Don't be too mean, because if you're too mean, I'm just gonna ignore it. Also, you can just give your tips and tricks to other people in the comments who want to learn leather working. After many more hours of sewing, I had all my cuffs ready, and I kind of needed to start thinking about how I was gonna assemble everything. So originally I said I would have my glove and then my cuff pieces kind of like on top. But yes, I did mention that I did not end up doing that. Instead, I kind of cut out every single one of my red pieces into smaller strips and essentially sewed everything individually. So the upper cuff is sewn to the glove, and then my first strip is sewn to the upper cuff. Then the mid cuff is sewn to the upper strip, and then the lower strip is sewn to the mid cuff, and then the lower cuff is sewn to the lower strip. I had to make sure that I had done all the holes for the thread on every single one of these pieces and then start sewing everything together. Now for the red section, so the width is whatever you want the width to be. Like, essentially put on your glove, put on your cuffs, and kind of see how much you need to fill in those gaps in between each. I think mine ended up being like about like maybe 3/4 of an inch. Obviously you need to add seam allowance so you have space to put your holes. And the way I calculated the length of each piece, what I did is, since my cuffs already have all their holes in, I would count how many holes and then just make sure I had the same amount of holes on the red piece, which makes sense. And then they would match up perfectly. So that's how I ended up finding my measurement for each piece. So they actually don't go straight like this. They kind of go at a slight angle, like at a slight curved angle, because that's what you need to do to accommodate the fact that each cuff is a bit bigger, and that's what looks nice. Also, Link has these weird interconnected like sections in between each cuff, so I just sewed those straight onto the red section. I used my thin leather and just used my sewing machine. So each one of these red section is then sewn right side to right side at the side, so make sure to keep that same allowance for that, and then is sewn by hand in the same manner that we've sewn everything before. So again, you start with a little knot, you go from underneath, whether it's starting at the glove or in one of the red sections, you start underneath, poke out through the top, loop around your cuff, and go back in, and you just keep going around and around that way. Things to keep in mind though is to make sure that your seams throughout your cuffs and red sections are aligned as much as possible. That looks nicer. And then that however you've put the seam on one side, like on the left or right side, that the other side matches and that everything is like the same on both sides essentially. So you can go ahead and like use your holes as a reference to like count where certain sections go and whatnot. But that's how I did it until I was all done. So I'm gonna put in some initial like little sexy shots here. Please enjoy. I hope you like it. I haven't filmed those sections yet, so I have no idea what they look like. I'm gonna have to film that. So, with the unarguably worst part out of the way, we're gonna take a look at how we did the belts. So I have the original piece here, wrong side. I'm gonna come all the way out here. So I'm gonna remove these little pieces, I think entirely, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do like tiny little whip stitches on the side. Now, the other thing is I find this to be too long and I don't want no Velcro pieces. Like I just want to sew this side to side on top of the belt and it won't move. But so what I did is, this is where it would fold out like this. I sewed this, I like folded this in half and now I know the piece that I need to remove. So we're gonna cut this out and attempt to do something nice. Okay, so the one thing I definitely want to do is I don't think I need this amount of thickness at the back. So I'm going to try to remove some of the thickness. This is a leather working tool. It's a blade. And what it does is it scrapes off some thickness from your leather. It's really hard to get it to be even, but I'm trying my best. And it's going to be stitched together like this. And then this part is still going to come underneath like this. It's going to be kind of like this. And this is going to be flapping over. It was okay. It looked cute enough. I think it's probably the option that looks the most like the original design of Link. But I, like I said earlier, wanted it to look like it was worked leather. So I wanted to add more stitching, which is so stupid, it takes so much time. I hate myself. No, I wanted to add more stitching because I thought it would be prettier and it would be reminiscent of whatever's going, like all the stitching that's going on in the gloves. Like otherwise, I just thought it was too much dissonance between the two. So keep in mind that that is not how I ended up doing my blocks. I ended up doing them completely differently, but this was my first initial attempt at doing something. So as mentioned earlier, I wanted to bevel the sides of my belt. So I did do that by using my leather beveler. It's like a little tool, you go on the sides and you bevel. But I'm not gonna lie here, my beveler is not sharp enough currently. It really needs to be sharpened. So I was really having a hard time. I was kind of like more scraping by than like cutting, and you can kind of tell. Sometimes that's not a big deal. In this case, for reasons that will become clear later, I couldn't quite hide that completely. So that was like kind of a mistake on my part. But we could lessen the look of that by finishing the sides, which we'll do the same way as we did for any of the other leather pieces. But before we do that, I also wanted to reshape the ends of my belt. So I'm gonna do that because it's gonna leave my edges raw, and I also need to bevel the ends. So yeah, I went ahead and cut that out, and then I beveled, and then I finished the whole sides. Because beveling is kind of on the surface and not just on the sides, I didn't feel comfortable using leather dye as I would have with my other pieces. For leathers, what I find is best if you want to bevel your edges is to buy a non-dyed leather strap, because when you cut it, obviously the color ends up being raw leather. And what you want to do is dye the whole thing in one go so it's nice and even all around. But this is the original belt that was used and it's already been dyed. And my fear, because I don't have the original dye, but also because if the dye overlaps, it'll become darker in certain sections. And I didn't want that. So I like beveled the edges, but it's not perfect. My blade was too dull, so it kind of gave it like weird, like a weird ridge that looks like it's been weathered more than like something clean. I don't mind it. I like the way the weathering looks on it. Like it looks like it's been around the block. Link's been around the block, you know? He's been on adventures and stuff. But if I wanted to adjust that, I think I would need to sharpen my blade, and then I would also need to add a bit more dye at the sides, because like right now it's much paler. It's because I didn't put any dye on it. But I'm reusing an old belt, so this one already got dyed before, and I'm scared if I dye it now, it's just gonna make the edges darker than the center, and that would be worse than having them be more pale, because if it's more pale, it just looks like it's been weathered down with time. And the first thing that weathers down with time are the edges of the belt, not the center. So I'm like, I think I'm just gonna keep it like that because at least like that, I think it looks good. And if I dye it and it ends up being darker, it won't look good. So I didn't put any dyes. Instead, I just went ahead and added my Tokonol all around and then used my burnisher to kind of smooth out the edges as much as possible. My burnisher looks a little weird. It's because it's supposed to go on a, like it's like a Dremel end. So it's supposed to go on a Dremel and you're supposed to use a Dremel. I don't know why I didn't use my Dremel. I did it by hand instead, which you can do by hand. Like originally that's just how you're supposed to do it, so it's fine. And then for the underside, it hadn't been finished, so I used like a wax block followed by Tokonol and like tried to flatten out and finish the underside as much as possible. Coming back to our little boxes, I tried out like our first test that I showed initially when we started this section of the video. But here's a second test where I tried to create like a side stitching, which again, I didn't like as much because we don't see the stitch and the stitch isn't keeping things flat as much as I like. So I settled on something that's a bit weird here. It's like a fake stitch. Like there's a stitch at the side, but it's not actually holding any pieces together because I wanted to avoid cutting too many separate pieces. So everything is in one piece and like we'll wrap around our foam piece, but the sides are long enough that they will wrap around completely so that they can be sewn shut on the underside on both horizontally and vertically. The stitch itself is like a faux stitch. It's not actually holding anything together. And to me, that's what looked the nicest. So that's what I decided to go with. The final pattern piece is a little bit weird. Essentially, like I said, like you have the main square piece, which is the same size as my foam. Then you have to extend it the length of the foam, which in this case is very, very thin. And then you have to extend each side to wrap around and meet at the lower bottom. My very long piece has the belt come in twice. So the sides that wrap around the belt need to be even a bit longer. I think they were about 6 millimeters longer total, something like that. Where I'm gonna have my holes to do my faux stitching is along the longest sides. So the whole stitching is gonna be done in one go. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. Just to make this section, I'm gonna have the pattern on the screen and I'm gonna highlight each dot that I'm going through. So I'm gonna come in through dot A. It's gonna be it's gonna make sense. It's gonna make sense with the diagram. Then go into dot B. And then wrap back into dot A and into dot B. So I'm doing like a double stitch here. Make sure it's nice and tight. And then come out through dot B. Come back in through dot C and then cross over to the next two holes and keep going until you're on the other side where you're gonna kind of repeat the same process as the beginning, where you're gonna come and loop twice around the side of the leather piece. And it looks really nice. In my opinion, that was my favorite option, but we are not done. We also need to punch in some holes on the ends and like close those shut. So I'm gonna start with what would be the sides that would follow along the belt, just to wrap in our little foam piece. And then we're gonna do the sides where the stitchings are, so those shut. And we're gonna use very regular like whip stitch for that. So yeah, I mean, we're almost done with our belt. Like at this point, all our pieces are done. So it's just a question of making sure that our buckles are in and then to insert all of these pieces. So originally the buckle was holding with just, I think, contact cement, but over time, the glue faded or something and it was just coming apart. So to make sure this time that it's as strong as possible, I'm just gonna add rivets where the buckle snaps in. But not just that, and this is what I recommend because I find it makes it easier and like a bit nicer. Where the section of the belt wraps around the belt buckle, I like to thin that section out with my leather blade so that once it's folded over, the total thickness of that section is about the same thickness as the rest of the belt. Because otherwise you end up with a lot of bulk at this section, which makes it a bit uncomfortable. I think it looks better essentially to thin that section out. And then me personally, I ended up putting gold rivets, but instead of rivets, you could also just hand sew that section shut. There's a lot of tutorials out there on how to properly do it's like a double thread stitch when you put two pieces like flat against each other, and it looks really good too. So you could do that. You don't actually need rivets. I just happen to have rivets at home. They were gold, so I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna put in gold rivets because it's a bit faster. Now that my belt is pretty much the belts themselves are done, I'm just gonna go ahead and insert all my block pieces. I'm gonna go in with my widest one first, the really long one, and then one smaller one. And then I have 11 that are kind of side by side along the belt. They don't shift around much. I made mine quite tight, but just to be sure, I did add a little bit of glue. I just used the Tokonol. It's kind of like a glue, but it's meant for varnishing, not for gluing pieces together. It can be used to glue pieces together, but it's supposed to be more of a temporary bond. You're supposed to secure it after with something else. But in this case, these aren't really going anywhere. So I think that's just a slight added security for the belt. That kind of finishes the belt. So again, we're gonna do a little reveal with some sexy photos. Okay, so for the hat, I won't go into too much details on how I made it. For the most part, the video tutorial that's up online right now is still pretty relevant, and you have in-depth instructions that come with the pattern. However, I do want to show you the difference between the old and the new hat. Isn't it wonderful? Honestly, it looks so much better now. Again, I do want to stress that I didn't remake the pattern during the process of making this. That was the pattern that came out with the original release of the pattern online. I just hadn't remade my hat since redoing the pattern. So it was just a little update for us here, but yeah. And unlike everything else in this, everything else in this vlog, the hat took me a grand total of 45 minutes. If your machines are set up that thing is zoom, 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 it is not long. It's an easy piece to put together. So yeah, now that we have all the pieces done, let's take a look at the results of the full costume put together. So let's put that on screen. Okay, the truth is I haven't actually shot those scenes yet, so I have no idea how the costume looks all together. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that everything looks super pretty and really badass. The sword was very kindly lent to us by WZ Prop. It's a beautiful prop, and I'm gonna put their details like Instagram and such in the description box below if ever you want to check them out. So yeah, let me know in the comment section below what you think of the results. If you don't like them, let me know why, but be kind once again. Again, if you're a leather worker and want to give your little tidbit, feel free. I welcome constructive criticism. Hopefully we'll be back soon with some new patterns and some new video tutorials. We've been on a semi-hiatus. We've still been producing stuff, but it's been a bit slower and a little bit more simple than some of the grander projects we've done in the past. And in the meantime, if you want to check out kind of what we're doing and on a more somewhat daily basis, you can check us out on our social media accounts outside of YouTube. And I think that wraps things up for today. So as always, good luck with your projects. Bye-bye. C'est sûr que je vais me ramasser un TikTok de quelqu'un, même. Tu sais qu'il y en a un quelque part, le temps de me filmer, ça va directement sur leur TikTok.